to curtail this. In April 1929, the Federal Reserve authorities called upon the member banks to reduce their loans on stock exchange collateral. At the same time, it engaged in open market operations, which reduced its holdings of bankers' acceptances from about $300 million to about $150 million. The sterilization of gold was made more drastic. Excuse me. It was hoped in this way to reduce the amount of credit available for speculation. Instead, the available credit went more and more to speculation and decreasingly to productive business. Call money rates in New York, which had reached 7% at the end of 1928, were 13% by June 1929. In that month, the election of a Labour government in England so alarmed British capital that large amounts flowed to the United States and contributed further to the speculative frenzy. In August, the Federal Reserve discount rate was raised to 6%. By this time, it was becoming evident that the prices of stocks were far above any value based on earning power, and that this earning power was beginning to decline because of the weakening of industrial activity. At this critical moment, on September 26, 1929, a minor financial panic in London, the Hattie case, caused the Bank of England to raise its bank rate from 4.5% to 6.5%. This was enough. British funds began to leave Wall Street, and the overinflated market commenced to sag. By the middle of October, the fall had become a panic. In the week of October 21st, on the stock exchange and the curb exchange in New York, total stocks sold averaged over 9 million a day. Some stocks fell by 100 or even 140 points a day. Auburn fell 210 points, General Electric 76 points, and US Steel 26 points in 4.5 days. By November 6, these three stocks had fallen respectively 55, 78, and 28 points more. It was a financial disaster of unparalleled magnitude. The stock market crash reduced the volume of foreign lending from the United States to Europe, and these two events together tore away the facade, which until then had concealed the fundamental maladjustments between production and consumption, between debts and ability to pay, between creditors and willingness to receive goods, between the theories of 1914 and the practices of 1928. Not only were these maladjustments revealed, but they began to be readjusted with a severity of degree and speed made all the worse by the fact that the adjustments had been so long delayed. Production began to fall to the level of consumption, creating idle men, idle factories, idle money, and idle resources. Debtors were called to account and found deficient. Creditors who had refused repayment now sought it, but in vain. all values of real wealth shrank drastically. The crisis of 1931. It was this shrinkage of values which carried the economic crisis into the stage of financial and banking crisis, and beyond these to the stage of political crisis. As values declined, production fell rapidly. Banks found it increasingly difficult to meet the demands upon their reserves. These demands increased with a decline in confidence. Governments found that their tax receipts fell so rapidly that budgets became unbalanced in spite of every effort to prevent it. The financial and banking crisis began in Central Europe early in 1931, reached London by the end of that year, spread to the United States and France in 1932, bringing the United States to the acute stage in 1933 and France in 1934. The acute stage began early in 1931 in Central Europe, where the deflationary crisis was producing drastic results. Unable to balance its budget or obtain adequate foreign loans, Germany was unable to meet her reparation obligations. At this critical moment, as we have seen, the largest bank in Austria collapsed because of its inability to liquidate its assets at sufficiently high prices and with enough speed to meet the claims being presented to it. The Austrian debacle soon spread the banking panic to Germany. The Hoover moratorium on reparations relieved the pressure on Germany in the middle of 1931, but not enough to permit any real financial recovery. Millions of short-term credits lent from London were tied up in frozen accounts in Germany. As a result, in the summer of 1931, the uneasiness spread to London. The pound sterling was very vulnerable. There were 5 principal reasons. 1. The pound was overvalued. 2. Costs of production in Britain which were much more rigid than prices. 3. Gold reserves were precariously small. 4. The burden of public debt was too great in a deflationary atmosphere. 5. There were greater liabilities than assets in short-term international holdings in London, about £407 million to £153 million. This last fact was revealed by the publication of the Macmillan Report in June 1931, right at the middle of the crisis in Central Europe, where most of the short-term assets were frozen. The bank rate was raised from 2.5% to 4.5% to encourage capital to stay in Britain. £130 million in credits was obtained from France and the United States in July and August to fight the depreciation of the pound by throwing more dollars and francs into the market. To restore confidence among the wealthy who were causing the panic, an effort was made to balance the budget by cutting public expenditures drastically. This, by reducing purchasing power, had injurious effects on business activity and increased unrest among the masses of the people. Mutiny broke out in the British fleet in protest against pay cuts. Various physical and extra-legal restrictions were placed on export of gold, such as issuing gold bars of a low purity unacceptable to the Bank of France. The outflow of gold could not be stopped. it amounted to £200 million in 2 months. On September 18th, New York and Paris refused further credits to the British Treasury, and 3 days later the gold standard was suspended. The bank rate still stood at 4.5%. To many experts, the most significant aspect of the event was not that Britain went off gold, but that it did so with a bank rate at 4.5%. It had always been said in Britain that a 10% bank rate would pull gold out of the earth. By 1931, the authorities in Britain saw clearly the futility of trying to stay on gold by raising the bank rate. This indicates how conditions had changed. It was realized that the movement of gold was subject to factors which the authorities could not control more than it was under the influence of factors that they could control. It also shows a hopeful sign that the authorities after 12 years were beginning to realize that conditions had changed. For the first time, people began to realize that the two problems, domestic prosperity and stable exchanges, were quite separate problems, and that the old orthodox practice of sacrificing the former for the latter must end. From this point on, one country after another began to seek domestic prosperity by managed prices and stable exchanges by exchange control. That is, the link between the two, the gold standard, was broken, and one problem was made into two. The British suspension of gold was by necessity, not by choice. It was regarded as an evil, but it was really a blessing. As a result of this mistake, many of the benefits which could have been derived from it were lost by trying to counterbalance the inflationary results of the suspension by other deflationary actions. The discount rate was raised to 6%. Valiant efforts to balance the budget continued. A protective tariff was established, and a program of fairly stiff taxes installed. As a result, prices did not rise enough to give that spur to production which would have been necessary to increase prosperity and reduce unemployment. No system of exchange control was set up. As a result, the depreciation of sterling in respect to gold standard currencies could not be prevented, and amounted to 30% by December 1931. Such a depreciation was regarded by the authorities as an evil, chiefly because of orthodox economic theories, which considered parity of exchanges as an end in itself, and partly because of the need to pay the £130 million in Franco-American credits, a burden which increased as sterling depreciated in respect to dollars and francs. As a result of the British abandonment of the gold standard, the central core of the world's financial system was disrupted. This core, which in 1914 was exclusively in London, in 1931 was divided among London, New York, and Paris. London's share depended on financial skill and old habits. New York's share depended on her position as the world's great creditor. Paris' share depended on a combination of a creditor position with an undervalued currency which attracted gold. From 1927 to 1931, these three had controlled the world's financial system, with payments flowing into the three, credits flowing out, and stable exchanges between them. The events of September 1931 broke up this triangle. Stable exchanges continued for dollar-franc, leaving dollar-pound and pound-franc to fluctuate. This did not permit an adjustment of the maladjusted exchange rates of 1928 to 1931. Concretely, the undervaluation of the franc in 1928 and the overvaluation of the pound in 1925 could not be remedied by the events of 1931. A sterling franc rate which would have eliminated the undervaluation of the franc would have resulted in a sterling dollar rate which would have overcorrected the overvaluation of sterling. On the other hand, the depreciation of the pound put great pressure on both the dollar and the franc. At the same time, Britain sought to exploit as much as possible her economic relations with her home market, the Empire, and that group of other countries known as the Sterling Bloc. The home market was set aside by the establishment of customs duties on imports into the United Kingdom, special customs duties November 1931, and a general tariff in February 1932. The Empire was brought into closer economic ties by a group of 11 imperial preference treaties made at Ottawa in August 1932. The Sterling Bloc was reinforced and enlarged by a series of bilateral trade agreements with various countries, beginning with Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Argentina. Thus the world tended to divide into two financial groups. The Sterling Bloc organized about Britain, and the Gold Bloc organized about the United States, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. The depreciation of sterling in relation to gold made the currencies of the Gold Bloc overvalued, and relieved Britain of that burdensome status for the first time since 1925. As a result, Britain found it easier to export and more difficult to import, and obtained a favorable balance of trade for the first time in almost 7 years. On the other hand, the gold countries found their depressions intensified. As a third result of the British abandonment of the gold standard, Britain freed herself from her financial subjection to France. This subjection had resulted from the vulnerable position of the British gold reserves in contrast to the bulging appearance of the French reserves. After 1931, the financial positions of the two countries were reversed. When Britain was able to add a financial superiority after 1931 to the political superiority she had possessed since 1924, it became possible for Britain to force France to accept the policy of appeasement. Moreover, the financial crisis of 1931 was to bring to power in Britain the national government, which was to carry out the policy of appeasement. As a fourth result, the countries still on gold began to adopt new trade barriers, such as tariffs and quotas, to prevent Britain from using the advantage of depreciated currency to increase her exports to them. The countries already of gold began to see the value in currency depreciation, and a possibility of races in depreciation began to form in the minds of some.